And welcome back, guys. We are continuing the theme of Rook endgames. In case you missed the endgame study, which I published yesterday on my channel, definitely check it out. It was a very beautiful endgame study, also featuring some rooks on the board. And with this position you see in front of us now, I want to start actually a new kind of format, which is to go through some theoretical endgames. And I want to start this series by, first of all, this rook endgame with the extra d-pawn, and then later on move on to some other ones. For example, if white has the extra c-pawn instead of the d-pawn, extra b-pawn, and extra a-pawn. Why is that so relevant for us? First of all, rook endgames specifically are, I think even statistically speaking, the most prevalent ones and the ones which you're going to encounter in your games the most. And I think that also speaking like from professionals, grandmasters, international masters, everyone has seen those positions, probably also studied them at some point. But at least if I'm speaking honestly for myself, last time I reviewed those endgames was first of all a long time ago, and I think it was also kind of superficial at some moment. Because you hear some things about the endgame, like there's this thing which you need to do. Of course, you need to activate the king all of the time. But yeah, I find it difficult to find material which is also well structured about those endgames. I mean, of course, everyone should check out Dvoretsky's endgame manual, which I, honestly speaking, did not take into preparation for this video. Maybe he has structured this very well too, but from the last time I remember reading that, I did not find it fully satisfactory how those endgames were discussed. At least it did not really stay in my mind. Maybe that was also my problem. But anyway, to sum it up, I want to do this type of format where I go through these endgames together with you. First of all, because I want to learn those endgames well myself, and I'm anyway preparing them for myself to know those endgames better. And I'm just thinking, if I can share that with you too, I can embed it in my memory a bit better, and also hopefully you guys can learn something from the series as well. So about this specific endgame, as I said, white has the 3 pawns on the king side and black has the 3 pawns on the king side as well. And in this video, we are checking out the endgame with the extra d-pawn. Probably the most prevalent is where white has the extra e-pawn, which is going to be covered in another video, which is probably also the easiest of all of those rook endgames to actually save a draw. Oh, and by the way, one thing which I forgot to mention was that I actually analyzed this specific endgame together with some of Austria's strongest youth players. That was a lot of fun, and we learned a lot there too. And this video is kind of a mix between what I did in preparation for the session with them and also what we learned together there. Also, we played some training games there in this endgame, and actually white was able to win a couple of the games in the training games too. So yeah, there's a lot of venom in this endgame, and now you can get back to video and hopefully enjoy what I have to say about the endgame which ensues. So we can start off by saying that the position is, of course, objectively a draw. The computer holds almost all of these positions with the extra pawn to a draw, unless white has the rook behind the pawn, which in this specific endgame is, if this pawn is so close to the king, it does not really matter. But if we imagine the pawn on the c or b or even on the a file, if the rook then is behind the pawn, then it's typically lost for black. Here, it doesn't really matter. Let me just make a couple of moves if white can have the rook on d1. It doesn't really matter because the king can anyway always control this pawn. Like, even if white can push this pawn, it's not really an outside passer. I mean, technically it is, but it's so close to all of the other pawns that having the rook behind the pawn here does not really matter. For example, like this, and white cannot really make any significant advances. If this king is here on the a file and the pawn is on a5, then it's a bit different, because then black's king is going to be so far away from all of the defense on the king side. Anyway, this specific position which you see was actually featured in this year's Grand Swiss between Vidit and Shant Sargsyan, who is a grandmaster from Armenia, also around like 2650, very, very strong. And I went through that game with a lot of interest to see how easy it would actually be for super grandmasters to hold this position. And you won't believe it, but Shant was actually lost in this game. So Vidit managed to press water from the stone from this endgame against against a very strong player who is around 2660 nowadays, quite frequently. So that was quite curious to me. Like if Shant, a 2660 player, has difficulties holding this endgame, then probably most of us are going to have some difficulties too. So that was one of the main motivations for me to have a closer look into this endgame. So Vidit started by going king f4. Now I'm going to tell you the most important thing from the start right away. From my analysis, from what I understand from the endgame now, is that black should strive to get the defensive formation by going f6 pretty soon at some moment. The best way to do that is to first have the king on e6 and then go for f6. I think if you know that, it's going to be way more easy to hold this endgame because, well, first of all, placing the pawn to f6, let's just say in a position like, where can we go there? For example, in a position like this here, which was we are still following the game. I just want to jump there because it's so important for me to say that. Here, for example, f6, in my opinion, is probably the easiest way to hold the endgame. Of course, it is weakening the pawn on g6, and sometimes white can pick it up with the rook, but at the same time, one of white's pawns is going to get lost on the way there. And typically, I think that one trade of pawns, doesn't really matter which pawn it is typically in black's favor. Like also if white would go for g4 at some moment, then after trading, typically it gets easier because typically the defensive side wants to exchange as many pawns as possible because then it's going to be less material on the board for the pressing side to capitalize on it. So that's the important thing at the start. I think that black should go for f6 in this position, just to guard the g5 square, also the e5 square in many positions. But it's mostly about the g5 square that the white king cannot enter there, because this could be at some moment quite an unpleasant thing. But let's go back a couple of moves to see how Vidit got there. So he played king f4, Shant played king f6, now rook d6 check was played, king e7, rook d5, and now rook b2, f3. And here is where I was saying I think that black's easiest way to defend is f6. And for example, if white would try to go after the pawn on g6, which is a reasonable try, then black can take here, rook takes g6, and now rook d5, and the h5 pawn is protected firmly, and the only way for white to make any advances is to go for g4, but now so many pawns are going to get exchanged that black's defensive task should be quite easy, for example like this, and just rook here. Black can also give checks at some moment, and it should be quite a straightforward draw. But Shant went for the move rook f2, which is also logical. I feel like he wanted to keep his options open by going f6 or not, which also makes sense because, as I said, if you're not like 100% familiar with the endgame and don't study it seriously, then I think it might be a difficult decision to play f6 here. So Vidit played rook e5 check, king f6, now d4. Rook f1 was played. Maybe rook d2 is a bit more of an active move, just immediately going after the d4 pawn, but it probably doesn't really matter for us, at least from an educational purpose. So black played rook f1, rook e3 now, rook d1, and now king e4. So this is one of the positions which white, I believe, should strive for in this endgame, because now white all of a sudden has at least some ideas. First of all, one big threat is now king d5. And black should really not allow this, because if white gets the king here and sort of firmly defends the pawns on the king side, then he is most likely winning, because then he can support the pawn on d4. So for example, if black would make a waiting move like rook f1, then king d5 would come, and now rook g1 doesn't really do anything that much anymore. I mean, first of all, I could imagine that something like this could already be winning, and the d pawn could be quite fast. But I mean, in this position, I would probably just play the move f4. Now the rook is beautifully defending the root of white's pawns on g3 nicely, and white can advance the d pawn sooner or later. Also keep in mind that here, if black were to give some checks on the a file, white always has the move king b5, and now the rook has one rank too little to give checks, and now black would have to stay passive, and now the pawn could advance further and further. So therefore, in the game, Shant played the move king e6, which is still the right defense. Now the idea is that king d5 is stopped, and the king cannot enter as easily. Vidit played king f4 check, now king f6. By the way, king d6 would be a terrible mistake because of king g5, and after rook takes d4, king f6, then white is gonna pick up probably all of those pawns on the king side. So black played king f6. Now Vidit played the move rook e4, and I believe that this is the exact position which white can kind of hope for, because now black is already in a position where he can definitely make some mistakes. And also about this position, why I said that it's so important to play f6 earlier on. If black now has the move f6 on the board already, let's just put the 0 move, and black has f6. Now if white goes king f4 check, black can just go for king d6, and the king cannot enter on g5 anymore. So this is one of the reasons why I think that going f6 pretty early on is definitely in black's interest. But king f4 check, this was the game, king f6, and now rook e4. Now black still has some ways to hold the draw here, but in the game Shant actually now made the decisive mistake already, which is a little bit ironic because it was move 42 and it was after the time control. But still, it also underlines the fact that black's defensive task here is not easy whatsoever. Shant went for the move rook f1, just keeping his eye on the pawn on f3. But now Vidit was in time to come with the king through the other side. So he played king e3, and after rook e1, king d3, the king ran over. Before we finish with that game, I want to point out some of black's defensive moves. I think that probably the most human way to hold this position still for black is the move rook d3, which at least avoids the move king e3, which was Vidit's idea to bring the king. But black has to be really careful after move g4. Now white's threat can be to go for g5 check, and after king g7 then to bring in the king and then promote the d-pawn. And if black were to play the automatic move h takes g4 now, and then try to retreat the king, now white would already be winning, because king e5 comes, and then maybe g5 to stop f6, and then maybe d5, d6 just, or d5, king d6, white will just slowly but surely be able to advance the d-pawn. So what does black need to do? He should not take on g4 here, but instead go for the move king g7 immediately. Now the point becomes clear. If white were to go for king e5 now black can go to f3 with the rook, but he's at the same time winning a pawn there, and black is just in time to save the draw here. But already here, it's not an easy defensive task for black. Like white could, for example, try to move g5, and if king f8 now, king e5, rook takes f3, king d6, and now black only has the one defensive move, rook g3. d5, rook g4, and the computer is holding this towards a draw, but still it does look scary. Like even if white just moves the rook somewhere and then tries to push the d-pawn, it's certainly not really a spot you want to be in if you're defending this from the black side. So again, I think you should go for the move f6 as early as possible, like for example in a position like this, and then always put the king to e6 or d6, just not to allow this what happened in the game. The computer also still says that king g7 is a draw, with later on then to play f6, king f7. So it underlines the fact again that f6 should be played in this endgame. But Shant went for the move rook f1, king e3, rook e1 check, and now Vidit was able to bring the king towards the queen side and together to support the d-pawn. White played king b5, rook b1 check, king c6, rook c1 check, king d6, and now white is ready to push the d-pawn. Shant tried to become active now with the move g5. That's probably his only chance. If he would try to go after the pawn on f3, now white can just play rook f4 check, king g7 and d5. Everything is protected on the king side, and white will slowly advance the d-pawn and should win. So Shant played g5, now d5 anyway, rook c3. Now Vidit took on g5, played rook f4, defending the pawn on f3. Black played f5, king e5, rook e3 check. Otherwise, white would just advance the d-pawn or just pick up the pawn on f5. So rook a3 check, king d4, and now rook a3. And here Vidit had, I would say, quite an easy win, at least for his level. I think on any other day he would have surely found it. The very simple move d6. Instead, he went for the move king to c5. Which is still also winning, but we'll get to that in a second. After d6, I'm honestly not really sure what he wasn't so sure of. Like if black goes for h4 now, which was played in the game under better circumstances, now white can just take here. And after rook f3, d7, black cannot even get the rook versus queen, which was in the game, because now the rook on h4 is protected. and white is just a full queen up. Maybe he wasn't sure about king f6, but now both d7 is winning, so that after king e7, white just picks up this pawn, and h5 is most likely going to get lost too. But king d5 is probably the cleanest. If rook d3 check, rook d4, and the ensuing pawn endgame is winning. For example, if king e6, d7, king takes d7, and king e5. Only nice thing is here that after f4, there's actually only one way to win, which is move g4. Again, some of those things might be what Vidit was unsure of. And, well, king c5, I mean, it is still winning, objectively speaking, but it does make the conversion a little bit harder. In the game now, shan't play the move h4, definitely the best practical try. Rook takes h4. G takes h4 is not possible because the rook on f4 is hanging. That was the whole idea. So white took on h4, rook takes f3, d6, and now rook takes g3. This is the best try. And now white has to give the rook on h4. And this was the endgame that ensued, which is objectively winning for white. Unfortunately, Vidit was not able to convert it to a full point here after his opponent defended really well. It's also, to be fair, not really easy to win those endgames if black really defends well, especially if there's still a pawn on the board. Even the normal rook against queen endgame, if you play against a computer, which I did on some occasions, I was not able to win the games at all points, because black always has this third rank defense, which is the best way to defend against to defend the queen against rook endgames, and it's not entirely simple. And here, especially with the extra pawn, it's not an easy win for white by any means. But anyway, all of this is kind of going a little bit too deep now. Anyway, our main goal was to go through this very typical endgame with 3 against 3 plus the extra d-pawn. So to summarize things, I think it's just important from the black side for us to know that we should try to get the king to e6 or to d6, and then to push the move f6 as soon as possible. For example, in this position, then keep the king on e6 or on d6, and there's no real way for white to make any more advances in this position. Like, white could try going for g4 at some moment, but as I said, if black manages to exchange some pawns, typically the defense would become easier, and for example, black could now go after the pawn on h4. And if you are trying to get that from the white side, I really like how Vidit played that. He put the rook to e3 and then tried to put the king to e4, which then asks some questions to black already, because we are trying to get in with the king towards d5 to the queen side. And if white manages that, to get the king to d5 or run over to the queen side like this via d3, c4, then black is very often lost already. I mean, considering the king is on f6, cut off from the d-file. Again, if black has the king on d6 and the pawn on f6, as I've said already on numerous occasions, then even entering with the king for white is simply not possible if the king is on d6. So that was it for today's video. I hope this was useful to some of you out there. I know that these endgames can be very, very complex, and I hope that I was able to shine some light onto them, how to defend them in a more simple manner, and from the white side, what are the key ideas to be able to play for a full point here. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. You can check out my socials in the video description down below. Also, you can find some courses, which I've did in the past for Chessbase and some other chess platforms too. Apart from that, I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.